This sounds impossible, but it's true. A man with no company, no title, and no limits owned a private island, flew a jet full of billionaires, and got away with abusing minors for years. His name Jeffrey Epstein. July 6, 2019. Teterboro Airport, New Jersey. The private jet had barely cooled when federal agents closed in. Jeffrey Epstein, financier, billionaire, socialite, stepped onto the tarmac expecting another routine arrival. For decades, he had moved through airports like this one, insulated by money, lawyers, and powerful friends. But this time, there were no handshakes waiting. Only handcuffs. As cameras flashed in the distance, Epstein said nothing. His face, usually masked by confidence, betrayed a flicker of disbelief. For the first time in his life, the world he had built of mansions, islands, and whispered influence began to collapse. But to understand how this moment came to be, we must go back. Not to a palace. Not to a jet. But to a modest childhood in Brooklyn. Jeffrey Edward Epstein was born on January 20, 1953, the son of a city parks worker. There was nothing extraordinary about his beginnings. Yet even early on, Epstein showed a sharp mind and a restless hunger not just for success, but for access. In the 1970s, he found himself teaching mathematics at an elite private school in Manhattan. It was here, among the sons of bankers and industrialists, that Epstein learned a lesson that would define his life: the world is not ruled only by intelligence, but by connections. He left teaching and drifted into finance. No clear degrees. No transparent record of how he rose. Yet somehow, doors opened. By the early 1980s, Epstein was working at Bear Stearns, then running his own mysterious money operation. He claimed to manage wealth for billionaires. But who exactly paid him and why has never been fully explained. By the 1990s, Epstein had reinvented himself. He was no longer just a man with money. He was a man with power. A 7-story mansion on Manhattan's Upper East Side. A vast estate in Palm Beach, Florida. Ranches in New Mexico. And later, a private Caribbean island, Little St. James. He filled these places with art, scientists, politicians, royalty, business tycoons. He hosted dinners where Nobel Prize winners shared wine with princes. He donated to universities. He spoke of philanthropy, of science, of shaping the future. To many, Epstein looked like a bridge between worlds. But to the vulnerable, he was something else entirely. Behind the gates of his mansions, a darker routine unfolded. Young girls, some barely in their teens, were recruited, often through friends, with promises of easy money for massages. What followed, survivors later said, was manipulation, coercion, and abuse. By the early 2000s, whispers began to spread in Palm Beach. Parents talked. Girls compared stories. And in March 2005, one mother went to the police. Her daughter, she said, had been taken to a rich man's house and paid for something no child should ever be asked to do. Palm Beach detectives started digging. What they found was not one victim, but many. Each story echoed the last. The same house. The same man. The same pattern. Jeffrey Epstein, the celebrated billionaire, was now the focus of a criminal investigation. Yet even as the walls began to close in, Epstein continued to host powerful guests, continued to fly his private jets, continued to live as if nothing could touch him. Because by then, he had learned the most dangerous lesson of all: in a world of big hots and billionaires, influence can be a shield. and Epstein had built his life around it. The trap was set. But who would fall into it and who would protect the man who built it? By 2006, the quiet streets of Palm Beach, Florida, had become the center of a storm. Inside a modest police building just blocks from the ocean, detectives laid photographs across tables, mapping out testimonies from girl after girl. They were not chasing rumors anymore. They believed they were looking at a system organized, deliberate, and cruel. They believed Jeffrey Epstein was running it. Subpoenas were issued. Phones were tapped. Officers knocked on doors of families who had never spoken before. And everywhere they went, the same name surfaced. The same mansion behind tall gates. The same promise of easy money. The same betrayal of trust. Palm Beach police recommended Epstein be charged with multiple counts of felony sexual abuse of minors. It should have been the beginning of the end. Instead, it became the moment the system blinked. The case was handed to federal prosecutors. And as it climbed the ladder of power, Epstein's true weapon revealed itself: not just money, but access. He hired the best defense lawyers in America. Former prosecutors. Legal titans who knew every hallway of power in Washington. Meetings were held behind closed doors. Letters were written. Pressure was applied. And in 2008, the unthinkable happened. Jeffrey Epstein was offered a deal. Not a trial. Not federal charges. But a plea agreement at the state level. He would plead guilty to 2 minor charges, soliciting prostitution and procuring a minor. In return, he would serve 18 months in jail, and even that would be softened. 6 days a week, Epstein was allowed to leave his cell for work release. He returned to his office. Met with lawyers. Lived much of his life as if he were still free. For the girls who had spoken to police, it felt like erasure. They had risked everything to tell their stories. And now, the man they accused was walking in and out of jail in a suit. But buried inside the deal was something even more shocking. A clause that protected not only Epstein, but also any unnamed co-conspirators. No names. No charges. No questions asked. To many, it looked like a shield thrown over the shadows. Epstein walked free in 2009, registered as a sex offender, yes, but still rich, still powerful, still hosting dinners. And the world around him barely blinked. This is where the idea of Epstein as a trapper took root. Not just trapping victims, but trapping influence. He placed himself among the powerful. Offered donations. Introduced people to each other. Flew them on his jets. Welcomed them into his homes. He made himself useful. Indispensable. And in doing so, he blurred lines. Who owed whom, who had seen what, who would speak if silence meant safety. There is no public proof that Epstein used blackmail. But former associates, journalists, and investigators would later suggest a darker possibility: that Epstein collected secrets as carefully as he collected friends. What is certain is this: after 2009, many who knew his past still visited him. Still took meetings. Still boarded his planes. Because power has a gravity of its own. And Epstein sat at its center. But outside those circles, something else was growing. Anger. Journalists began digging. Survivors began finding each other. Lawsuits were filed. Names appeared in court papers. Not accusations but connections. And slowly, the silence that had protected Epstein for years began to crack. By 2018, a series of investigative reports would tear the lid off the secret deal that saved him. The world would finally look back at Palm Beach, and ask how justice had been traded away. And once that question was asked, there would be no turning back. Epstein had escaped once. But the net was tightening. By the summer of 2018, the name Jeffrey Epstein was no longer whispered. It was printed. On front pages. Across headlines. And in a single phrase that would shake the country: perversion of justice. That was the title of the Miami Herald's investigation, a deep dive into the 2008 deal that had spared Epstein from federal prison. Reporters tracked down victims the world had forgotten. They uncovered secret letters. They exposed how prosecutors had negotiated behind closed doors while girls waited for answers. The story exploded. Public outrage followed. Politicians demanded reviews. Federal judges began asking hard questions. And in New York, federal prosecutors reopened the case. Epstein, now in his mid-60s, continued to live like a king. In his Manhattan mansion, he hosted guests beneath crystal chandeliers. On his private jet, he crossed oceans as if borders meant nothing. But for the first time in years, something had changed. The shield was cracking. On July 6, 2019, when Epstein landed at Teterboro Airport, he was arrested and charged in the Southern District of New York with sex trafficking of minors and conspiracy to do so. The indictment was blunt. It accused Epstein of running a system that recruited underage girls, brought them to his homes, and paid them to perform sexual acts, then encouraged them to bring more girls. This time, there would be no quiet deal. He pleaded not guilty. But the judge denied bail. Epstein was taken to the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Lower Manhattan, a stark concrete tower that had held terrorists, mob bosses, and spies. For a man used to private chefs and personal drivers, it was a different world. And the world was watching him. Victims lined up to speak. Civil lawsuits poured in. Names of powerful people surfaced in court filings, not as defendants, but as part of Epstein's orbit. Important truth remained: association did not mean guilt. But the spotlight was relentless. For the first time, Epstein faced the possibility of a public trial, one that could expose not just his crimes, but the machinery around him. Then, on August 10, 2019, just after 6 in the morning, guards found Jeffrey Epstein unresponsive in his cell. He was pronounced dead shortly after. The official ruling: suicide by hanging. But almost instantly, the questions began. Why had his cellmate been removed? Why were guards said to be asleep? Why were cameras malfunctioning? For many, it felt like a final betrayal, not just of justice, but of truth. Epstein's death meant there would be no trial. No cross-examination. No public reckoning. For survivors, it was devastating. Years of waiting ended in silence. But even in death, Epstein could not end the story. Because attention turned to the one person who had stood beside him for decades. Ghislaine Maxwell. Socialite. Daughter of a media tycoon. Constant presence at Epstein's side. In the photos, she was smiling. In the stories, she was recruiting. And in July 2020, nearly a year after Epstein's death, federal agents arrested her in a quiet town in New Hampshire. The net had closed again. And this time, someone else would have to answer. July 2, 2020. Bradford, New Hampshire. In the early morning quiet of a small New England town, federal agents surrounded a secluded property. Inside was a woman who had spent a year in hiding, living under an alias, waiting. Ghislaine Maxwell. For decades, she had been more than Jeffrey Epstein's companion. To prosecutors, she was the organizer, the one who found girls, gained their trust, and delivered them into Epstein's world. Her arrest sent a clear message: even with Epstein gone, the case was not. Maxwell was charged with conspiracy, sex trafficking of minors, and perjury. She pleaded not guilty. And in November 2021, her trial began in a Manhattan courtroom, just miles from the jail where Epstein had died. Inside, the atmosphere was heavy. Women took the stand and told stories they had carried for years of being teenagers, of being offered money, of being told powerful people could protect them, or destroy them. They spoke of Maxwell's voice, her smile, her promises, and then, of the doors closing. The jury listened. And on December 29, 2021, Ghislaine Maxwell was found guilty on 5 federal counts. In June 2022, she was sentenced to 20 years in prison. For many survivors, it was the first true moment of justice. Not complete, not enough, but real. Yet even as the courtroom doors closed, the larger questions remained. How had Epstein built such a vast network? How did he move so freely among big hots for so long? And how did he make his money? To this day, Epstein's fortune remains a mystery. He claimed to manage billions for ultra-wealthy clients. But no public records have ever fully explained who they were or how his operation worked. Some investigators believe he exaggerated his wealth. Others suspect hidden backers. What is certain is that his money gave him the illusion of legitimacy, and legitimacy gave him access. And with access came the trap. Epstein didn't just lure victims. He lured status. He made himself a gateway to funding, to influence, to introductions. He placed himself where ambition met opportunity. And in that space, he became untouchable. For years. Until courage broke through silence. In the years after his death, civil lawsuits continued. Settlements were paid. Documents were unsealed. Names appeared in court records not as convictions, but as reminders of how close Epstein had come to the centers of global power. Again, the truth had to be said: being named is not the same as being guilty. Justice demands evidence. But the pattern was undeniable. A man with no clear origin of wealth had moved among the world's elite, while abusing the vulnerable. And the system had failed to stop him. What does the Epstein story leave behind? It leaves laws strengthened around victims' rights. It leaves prosecutors under scrutiny. It leaves a public far less willing to accept quiet deals. And it leaves a warning that in every era, there are figures who learn how to bend power to their will, who hide behind influence, who believe the world belongs to them. Until it doesn't. Narrator. Final words: Jeffrey Epstein never faced a jury. But his story stands as a reckoning not just of one man, but of every institution that looked away. The girls he harmed are no longer silent. The deals that protected him are no longer hidden. And the lesson is written in history: no fortune is great enough, no name is powerful enough, to stand forever against the truth. This was the world of Jeffrey Epstein. And the price paid when power is allowed to run unchecked. Candle. End of documentary.